Oh, good afternoon and hello, everyone. I am Amy Kurtz-Lansing. I'm the curator here at the Florence Griswold Museum, and I want to thank you for joining us today and hopefully continuing to join us next week for home improvement, which this year's theme is innovation, inclusion, and inspiration. And we'll focus this week on accessible tours. I know I'm looking forward to learning a lot from this. This will be a 90-minute program consisting of presentations by two of our HAHS members and then a moderated discussion among the presenters. Because this is a webinar presentation, all of you participants have been muted, but please use the Q&A module to send us questions, and we'll answer as many as we can as the program moves along. And this program is being recorded, so you will all receive a link to that in the follow-up email. Here at the Florence Griswold Museum, we're really thrilled to partner for the third year in a row with the National Trust and its program on historic artists' homes and studios to bring you this speaker series. Valerie Ballant, who is the director of HAHS, will be the co-host today, and she is going to say a few words about HAHS. Valerie?
Great. Thank you, Amy. As I mentioned last week, Historic Artist Homes and Studios is thrilled to be hosting for the third year this series in partnership with the Florence Griswold Museum as part of a celebration of National Preservation Month. Historic Artist Homes and Studios, which we often refer to by our acronym HAHS, is a membership network of 61 sites in 25 states throughout the country, which were all the former homes and studios of American visual artists. HAHS is a program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and the Florence Griswold Museum has been a valued member of this program since it began in 1999. In 2020, we released a guide which serves as a wonderful introduction to this program and our membership site. It is available through our publisher, Princeton Architectural Press, and at all major retailers, and we will drop a link to that in the chat. One of the core aspects of our work is advocacy for the ongoing preservation of artist spaces in this country, in particular, sites of artistic legacy that have been historically underrepresented. And so earlier this week, the National Trust announced its 11 most endangered list, one of its longest standing and largest annual initiatives. And the process towards final selection for this list is rigorous, and HAHS was honored to contribute to this effort this year. We're delighted among this year's designees are the former homes and studios of two African American artists, 19th century painter Henry Tanner's home in Philadelphia, and 20th century folk artist L.V. Hall's artist-designed environment in Mississippi. Dedicated and passionate individuals are working to preserve these sites for future visitor engagement, and you can learn more about their efforts through the link Amy will put in the chat. Another key part of our work is to foster peer exchange among our member sites, and to provide opportunities to learn from one another, which is why we launched this series, Home Improvement, in 2021. And we seek to highlight specific projects happening at HAHS sites today. And for those who are new to the program today, our format is intentionally focused on project case studies rather than virtual tours of sites or presentations of historic narrative. So the other key goal of this series is to expose our public audiences to dialogues that are usually restricted to conversations among professional peers. And so we hope to provide peeks into the work that we do. And today's session focuses on the impactful ways in which immersive opportunities intrinsically available at HAHS sites can be activated to open possibilities for new audiences and making our sites more accessible to a wider range of individuals. And the programs you're going to hear about today are innovative and powerful. And for me, they beautifully encapsulate the words of another artist represented in the HAHS network, artist and arts educator Mabel D'Amico, whose former home is preserved on Long Island's East End. And D'Amico once said, "Art breaks the barriers of language, race, and creed. It is an international language." And so I hope you're going to keep that sentiment in your mind today during today's presentation. I'm delighted, of course, to be hosting this series again in collaboration with the Florence Griswold Museum, which offers their own wealth of programs for diverse audiences. And I want to thank our speakers today and the entire staff at the Florence Griswold Museum, in particular, David Rao, Director of Education and Outreach, Tammy Flynn, Director of Marketing, and my co-host for today, Curator Amy Kurtz-Lansing, who will introduce our first speaker. Amy?
Thanks, Valerie. So our first speaker this week is going to be Michelle Crow-Dolby, who is the Education and Communications Manager at the Gari Melchers Home and Studio in Falmouth, Virginia. She is going to be speaking about Picturing New Connections, a memory loss program, and I will put her bio in the chat so you can read more about her. Michelle?
Thanks, Amy. Thanks to Amy, Valerie, and David for inviting me on today's program to talk about Picturing New Connections, a program that's very near and dear to my heart. I'm going to start with just a quick overview of our site, Gari Melchers Home and Studio. This is an aerial view. We overlook the beautiful Rappahannock River in Falmouth, Virginia. We are located about halfway between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia. And you see front and center the historic house, which dates to the 1790s. And then behind that, the stone studio, which was purpose-built for Gari Melchers in the 1920s. To the left of the studio is our event space, which is a relatively new addition. And then in the background are some of the farm buildings, because this operated as a small farm when the Melchers lived here. Our site is about 16 acres, and we have 7 full-time staff and 15 to 20 hourly staff members. So now I'm just going to sort of switch the view. We're now looking at the back of the house, and you see the Rappahannock to the right, and then diagonally kind of angled to the right is the studio with that north-facing window. And we also see the backs of the farm structures. So a little bit about Gari Melchers. Here he is in the 1920s on the left, posing with his wife Corinne on the back steps of Belmont. He's dressed in his painting overalls. He was, believe it or not, internationally known during his lifetime. I'm sure he's not a household name now. He lived abroad for several decades, but always tried to maintain a commercial base in a studio in New York City. He was a diverse painter, both in style and in subject, and he gained critical and commercial success during his lifetime. He was even commissioned by Charles Lang Freer to paint the portrait of President Theodore Roosevelt. On the right, you see, this is sort of a front-on view of the studio. And you'll notice that in addition to the north-facing window, the large window, it also has skylights on the gallery wall ceilings. And as most artists are, he was definitely very concerned with natural light and liked to paint by it and also exhibit his work using natural light as well. So the development of Picturing New Connections, I was definitely inspired by the Meet Me at MoMA program, although I didn't hear about it for several years afterwards. But when I did find out about it, and I, just was consuming all of the resources that they provided through that wonderful, groundbreaking program, I thought, this could be a good fit for us. I'm really passionate about creating and teaching museum programs for underserved populations in our community. And when I started to do my research, I realized that there weren't any similar museum programs within 60 to 90 miles of our site. So I reached out to our local Alzheimer's Association branch, and Lori Myers there was really supportive and helpful, and encouraged me to continue my research. And several years later, With her assistance, we launched our 2019 pilot program. So Picturing New Connections is twofold. So the first part is art looking in the studio, and the second part is art making in our event space. So with the art looking portion, we are really focusing on feelings, not facts. I don't talk about dates. I don't include anything related to art history. I really don't talk much about Gari Melchers. We're focusing on the paintings and how they make us feel. We are very lucky at Gari Melchers Home and Studio that while this program is taking place, we have exclusive use of the studio. So I'm able to limit any distractions. I've seen this type of program take place in large museums that cover a lot of ground, and it does make it much harder because, you know, it's loud. There are a lot of people moving around. You have to, you know, travel long distances, and we're a very compact space. And so that works well with this program. I always include elements of smell, touch, and music in each of the programs. Sometimes people who are not very verbal can respond very strongly to some of those elements. And that's always fun to see. I like to select paintings that are large, relatable, and I'm able to group them in a small area, so we don't have to walk around to see all of them, or they're all right there. And I also try and use themes that are relatable to this population. So here are some pictures of the program in action. Top left, that's me with a wooden yoke that's actually featured in the painting below called In Holland. And we pass that around, and that sparks a lot of conversation. I like to pass down different items from my education collection. On the bottom left, those are some participants clapping along to a song. I believe the song is John Denver's Thank God I'm a Country Boy. We were talking about chores that day and working on farms and growing up in the country. And the bottom right, that's we had talked about doing laundry and ironing and all the fun chores. So I passed around a candle that had the scent of fresh linen. And again, that, you know, sparked a lot of memories and a lot of conversations. So the art making side of things, again, we're so fortunate we're able to very easily transition from the pavilion to our event space without taking any elevators. It's not a long distance. The restrooms are located nearby. So it's very easy to make it to sort of this classroom space. It's filled with natural light. During this time, I like to provide snacks just because who doesn't love snacks? And it makes it just a very casual, inviting atmosphere. For the art projects themselves, I try to focus on process art. So we're not so concerned about the end product as we are with just the creation of, you know, focusing on the creative side of things. That bottom picture, they were making a stained glass window, which was reminiscent of the stained glass window that was in one of the paintings that we talked about that day. Everyone gets to take home a postcard of the painting one of the paintings that we talked about, just as a reminder of their visit. And I am always so grateful that we have volunteers from the Alzheimer's Association available throughout the program to be available for the caregivers. Especially during this art making section, because it is so casual and people are kind of moving around and chatting with everyone. And so if a caregiver has a concern or a question, they're able to, you know, very privately talk to one of the Alzheimer's Association volunteers, and they also just bring some of their literature and make sure that everyone in attendance knows the different resources that the Alzheimer's Association offers for memory loss patients. Okay. So why it works for us and a few little lessons learned. I mentioned earlier that we're a small site and that we have exclusive use of the studio. So the public is not allowed in the studio for the, that 30 minutes or 40 minutes. I'm really excited that we can do that. Also, I have the support of our curator, and she will pull certain paintings out of collection storage that I'm interested in and actually put them on easels so we can group the paintings, in a small area. And that makes it easier when I'm teaching. And it also gets people, closer to the art. So when I first started in 2019, I did not have these amazing blue foldable museum chairs. And if you don't have them already, I would run out and buy them, although they are kind of pricey, but it's a wonderful investment for your education program. And they really do make things so much easier. I mentioned when I incorporate touch into picturing new connections, that I use items from the education collection. So that's something that I started and I've been adding to throughout my entire tenure here at Gari Melchers Home and Studio. And really, it's just me kind of just going through antique stores and picking out items that relate to Gari Melchers' artwork. And those are things that I can then bring out for different programs, and they can hold it in their hands and feel the weight of it and the texture and pass it around. So those come in handy. And if you don't already have an education collection, I would strongly advise to start one. So what's next? So over the pandemic, of course, everything in person came to a screeching halt. And unfortunately, this type of program did not work very well over Zoom. So we are just thrilled that we are back in person and that we are continuing to work with the Alzheimer's Association. And we're just excited to see what the future brings. Currently, I'm teaching this program quarterly. I was teaching it just twice a year, so I've upped it to quarterly. And, if the demand is there, I would love to teach it monthly. So that's kind of where we're headed. I look forward to hearing your questions, and I guess I'll turn things over to Sasha here in just a minute. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michelle. Your talk wonderfully illustrated how all the sensory richness of a HAHS site like Gari Melchers Home and Studio can be activated in new ways to provide meaningful experiences for individuals and families navigating what is the ever-evolving reality that comes with memory loss. And as you insinuated at the end, your program meets what we know sort of field-wide is an increasing need for this type of programming. But it also demonstrates, I would argue, something sort of fundamental about HAHS sites, that these places of historic creativity can today serve as conduits for tapping into something that's really visceral, the power of place, of art, and really the basic human desires to express and to engage in community. And at their core, HAHS sites are immersive and experiential, and that allows for these unique types of experiences that, as you alluded to in your talk, are completely distinct from looking at a painting or discussing it in a traditional museum space. And I like to argue that there's always a certain kind of residual energy present in a place where someone used to make something, where they considered ideas and had tactile experience. And that's some of that kind of ekes through today. And so when you inhabit that as a visitor, it often opens something actually in yourself, which is what some of your images really, I think, without any captions, without us knowing who they are, I think we could really understand them. And that makes a place like the Melchers site so beautifully suited for this type of programming. So I thank you for providing a window into this program and for unpacking for everyone your thoughtful work, but also the practical considerations that have to go in to developing a successful program like this one. And I know that these experiences will be helpful to colleagues who are interested in developing programs like this one. And I think something everyone could appreciate is your deliberate activation of all the senses in this program, not just looking at art, but being able to tune in to the wide variety of sensory cues that frankly we all respond to daily, from sound to taste to smell and even touch, and the opportunities that can come specifically through that type of stimulation and activation. And in our next presentation, we're going to do a deeper dive into ideas around touch in an artistic space. And so now I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Sasha Davis is the executive director of the Renee and Chaim Gross Foundation in Lower Manhattan, New York City. And her talk today is entitled Tactile Transmissions at the Renee and Chaim Gross Foundation. Sasha.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Valerie, for the introduction, and thank you to Amy and David, as well as Valerie, for organizing such an exciting program. I'm really happy to be here and also to learn more about the Gari Melchers program, so thank you. So I'm hoping that my talk today will encourage you to consider coming for one of the programs or finding someone or thinking of someone in your life who might benefit from tactile transmissions. The Renee and Chaim Gross Foundation preserves and interprets the historic home, studio, and art collections of Chaim Gross, who is a 20th century sculptor. His wife, although not an artist herself, was a very significant person in his life. She was the manager of his career later and also was a muse to him. Our mission is to further their legacies through research, exhibitions, and public programming. We are located at 526 LaGuardia Place, which is a 4-story brick building right in the heart of Manhattan. We're just south of Washington Square Park in Greenwich Village. And the Grosses called this home since 1963 when they fully renovated the building. So in addition to being a very prolific artist, Chaim Gross was a very passionate collector. We have around 12,000 objects in the collection now, in addition to an archive and a library that you can see a little wedge of at the bottom of this particular photo. The collection includes works of African arts, American art, European, Oceanic, pre-Columbian, and decorative arts, some of which you can see in the photo, but also behind me as well. The third floor, which is what I'm showing here, is installed the way it looked when the Grosses lived here. And on the first floor, we have Chaim Gross's studio. So this is a space that he worked in for nearly 3 decades. And he would draw, carve, model, do watercolors, all in this space. He was also photographed, filmed, and interviewed in this space. So it continues to be an active space that we use for tours, but also the program Tactile Transmissions. And here I'm showing Gross in the studio. He was known primarily as a direct carver, often in wood. So he championed this method, and what's significant about it is that it requires direct response to the material. You're emphasizing the log's shape, proportion, color, grain, what it has inherent to it, what's natural. And although direct carving is essentially a subtractive and common method that's been used for thousands of years, what made it significant in sort of the modern art context was this focus on truth to materials, making it fine art and not decorative art. He used tropical hardwoods, things like lignum vitae, ebony, and mahogany. And in New York City in the early and mid 20th century, there were a lot of lumber yards receiving these kinds of materials. So Gross described this affinity with the material and with the wood that he would go through slow examination of the piece, hefting it, lifting it up, tapping it in different places. And in 1938, the photographer Elliot Ellishoffen did a whole series of him working on this sculpture called Acrobats Balancing. Chaim eventually took all of these photos and turned them into part of the illustrations for his book, The Technique of Wood Sculpture. And that particular publication is really important for us to understand the importance of touch. And it's really one of the only places where Chaim Gross goes into great detail about why touch was so central to his working. And so this photograph is from a year later than the previous one. This is from 1939. And this captures the author and activist Helen Keller touching one of Chaim's sculptures. So Chaim Gross is shown in the background. He's kind of looking towards Keller, who's touching the sculpture. And this sculpture was in bronze. It was displayed outdoors for the Sculptors Guild exhibition. But this is sort of that light bulb moment that a lot of people have when they're here in terms of when we talk about the sculpture and then seeing this image, kind of making that connection that it is so informative to have that kinesthetic experience. It's also what helped us to sort of develop this idea of having access programs centered on touch. Similar to the Melchers house, we are very small. We're even smaller. We have 3 staff members. And although we have a 4-story building, with a lot of collected works, we have the ability as a small entity to be fairly nimble. And we can essentially have the space devoted to these activities in a different way. It's very intimate. And we had previously dabbled with different methods of introducing touch into different programming. So for example, particular workshops, or bringing objects to schools that served blind students, but we didn't have really a formalized program. So tactile transmissions was sort of in discussion for a few years, but we didn't actually pilot the program until 2019, so similar to Michelle's program. The initial sessions were aligned with a temporary exhibition on the foundation's 2nd floor. So the 1st floor has the studio, the 2nd floor is a temporary exhibition space, and then the 3rd floor is the living spaces. So this exhibition was called Teaching Through Touch Works by Chaim Gross, and it really delved into his different materials that he used, the different methods that he used, and included a mixture of bronze, stone, and wood sculptures, in addition to a selection of drawings that were related to the sculptures. So we also chose the drawings to be discernible to people who are low vision. So a lot of times they are very, very graphic or have a lot of contrast or high contrast. We provided exhibition labels in both large print and braille formats, and also offered thin disposable gloves for people to use when appropriate. And what's significant about this show as well is that we were not just trying to reach only the low vision and blind community, but we wanted all our visitors to touch the sculptures. So that was part of all of our tours and all of our visits. So tactile transmissions specifically was designed as an 1.5 hour long program. So that's what we consider to be enough time to really deeply engage with the works we wanted to focus on. And it combines various methods, including verbal description, touch, and making of art, drawing, but sculptural methods as well. We hold it in a very small group setting, so usually less than 10. And that really allows participants to get to know one another. Also, they get to know our staff, and they get to know the educators as well. I mentioned they use different materials, and those are related to the works that they're touching as well. So I want to give a lot of credit to the incredible Access community that already exists. We would not have been able to do this without their support. We specifically worked with our wonderful consultant and educator, Pamela Lawton, but she was one of many who was involved in these initial discussions. But she was really the one who helped us develop this exact program. I'm happy to talk more about that, but I think the importance of that understanding is that without talking to people who are doing this work already or who benefit from these programs, you're not going to have a full picture of how best your program can serve others. So I'm going to talk through a few slides and describe what's happening in them and talk a little bit about the program sort of details. Although I will say that every program is different. Our educators are incredibly creative, and they oftentimes will come up with a syllabus, and then when they speak to the group and find out they have maybe some other interests, they change directions a little bit. So they really have that capacity to work with the group that's in front of them. So in both of these photos, I'm showing Touch of Sculpture on the left, a finished piece. That's in the Teaching Through Touch exhibition space. And then on the right, that is touching of a work in progress. And the work in progress is very interesting because Chaim Gross was a figurative artist. He mainly did the female figure. But what's interesting about that work is because it's unfinished, you have this sensation of trying to kind of piece it together and understand what it's supposed to represent. You're also able to feel the tool marks. Gross left a lot of his tool marks on his finished works so that you understand the hand of the artist. But in that case, you know, because it is unfinished, you get to really, really see how much he's done. And in that case, we have a work that is also included on our tours as a touch object. So even if you're not here for one of the tactile transmissions programs, you will have the opportunities to touch the work. Another method, in addition to touching and describing the work, is to draw. And so this has become a very important part of our work from the beginning in tactile transmissions, is different methods of drawing. So usually there's some kind of warm up. So physically, you kind of shake out or do some movements. Then there's touch of sculpture. And sometimes, as in the picture on the left, our participant is drawing directly from their tactile sensation. On the right, the group is drawing to verbal description, or if they have some vision, maybe what they can see of the work that's being described. We've also been able to get quite creative with different kinds of materials. Typically, what we started with were things like pencil, charcoal, wax crayon, water-soluble pastel, masking tape, which can be layered up and made sort of into a sort of a raised line drawing. Types of paper, we use drawing paper, watercolor paper, and newsprint, which can become sort of a collage element. On the left, you're seeing visitors working with wiki sticks. So wiki sticks are these very thin pieces of wax wrapped around yarn that can be then placed on the paper. So once again, you can create a tactile three-dimensional drawing. We also use Model Magic, which is an air-dried clay alternative. Or as you see on the right, you can use wire to create a three-dimensional drawing. This is also very similar to the method that Chaim Gross would have used to create an armature, or sort of the skeleton of the interior of a model. So you might have noticed in some of these photos, some are masked, some are not. So this program has returned now after the pandemic in person, but we are still doing a virtual element. So this actually is a photo of a Zoom screen. So I hope that doesn't throw anyone off. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the significance and the importance of continuing a virtual version of a lot of these programs. It's very challenging. And when it was originally proposed to me by the educators, I was concerned it would be less effective. However, we've had an even better turnout for many of our virtual programs. And this is for a variety of reasons, but a lot of the people who use these programs have limited mobility. Sometimes they have other health conditions. And so these programs are really significant to their social lives. So we have continued to have both an in-person and virtual component, even returning back to a mostly in-person structure otherwise. We also found that geographically, we were able to pull more people in. So we have visitors coming in from Canada, from all across the US, even people who wake up fairly early on the West Coast to join us. We do them the second Thursday of the month. So our next session is on June 8th. Virtually, we will be available from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern. And in person, we have 12:30 to 2 p.m. also Eastern time. As I said before, if you would want to join us or know someone who would be interested in the program, please visit our website. We would love to have you participate. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha, for that engaging presentation and for making, I think, what was such a strong connection between the core tenet of Chaim Gross's own artistic practice and how that can serve as an authentic underpinning to such a groundbreaking program like Tactile Transmission. And so through this program, you're able to continue the very ethos of what Gross himself sought to teach about art, and that provides a lovely bridge, I think, between the stewardship of historic artistic legacy and relevant contemporary public engagement. Your talk beautifully also illustrated how exhibitions and programs are often so deeply linked in the work that we can do, and how each sort of informs the other in a sort of a constant push and pull relationship in this work. Something I thought was really interesting at the end was learning about how you and your staff then thoughtfully really examined both during and sort of as we continue to evolve in the new paradigms created by COVID, this sort of consistent evaluation, as Michelle also did, because different audiences require different things, and retooling, which is something that I think many HAHS colleagues who are involved in programming can relate to. And you've shown pathways by which visitors can actively engage with museum objects and tools, which I'm sure we're going to ask more about, but gaining very, very clearly a better understanding into art practice. So, but what I know personally, having visited both the Gross and Melchers sites, where you have amazing backgrounds behind you that give a little peek and taste into what awaits people if they come, is that these are two incredibly intact sites within the greater HAHS network, and where one gets to experience not only artistic and domestic spaces, art making tools, and artworks themselves in abundance, but also robust collections of the personal items that inform these artists' daily lives. And what this all leads to is a very holistic engagement and a richness of experience, which I believe particularly lends itself to these types of programs. And so both you and Michelle have wonderfully explained how these types of enriching programs can be created to include new audiences and how that needs to address specific needs, but also how those same programs can provide new opportunities for other audiences at the site to experience it. And so I love that sort of multi-layered dimension to these programs. And so as we move into the conversational part of this program, I'd love to ask Amy to pose the first question to you as we move into our conversation. Thank you,
Yeah,
Amy.
thank you, Valerie. Michelle, I'm going to direct my question to you, although Sasha, you can also think about it as well. And Michelle, you're the real driver of your program. You mentioned how you discovered the MoMA program and that inspired you. But what kind of expectations did you bring to that project, or other people at your site, other staff? Did the people have concerns about it, or and then how did you kind of adjust or incorporate or address those into the refinement and implementation of the program?
I think having a pilot program was important for our site, because you could just say, we're just going to try it. We're just going to see how it goes and make adjustments after that. But oddly enough, didn't really have to make many adjustments. I think if you think it through enough, you're going to think of all the different possibilities, things that could happen, and I walked it through in my head so many times. And there just weren't a lot of issues to address. I mean, I think the biggest thing was the chairs. And that was easily solved. So, and it wasn't a big deal. It was just really hard to set them all up and take them all down, and they're heavy and that kind of a thing. And, stacking them up in the studio, I'm sure made our curator a little nervous. So having those, very lightweight, easy to move chairs made a big difference.
And Sasha, how about you? Was that something that you had to, what were the different thoughts about implementing a program like this at your site where people are touching?
Everyone was completely supportive. There was a lot of trust that, the way I think of objects, which I'm an object-centered person, but that I and my colleagues would be very, very respectful and responsible, and have conversations with educators and conversations with conservators about best practices and how to treat these objects. So I would say that there weren't really there was no pushback at all. And I would say that going in, there was the understanding that this was a big investment in terms of our time, energy, financially, in every single way, but that it was worth it, and that the time taken to do the research, do the pilot program, do the exhibition was all leading to a greater good.
Thank you. And so sort of thinking about, in the end, since these are collections-based programs in the end, which I think is pretty fascinating. So how do you both alluded to it a little bit, but, I think for both of you, related question, but slightly different given audience. So I'm curious how you select or continue to select what you focus on, knowing that, as you said, Sasha, the people who deliver this program can be very nimble. But, Michelle, you referenced the fact that there were particular themes that you like to use that speak to this audience. And I think I'd be curious to know, what are those? And then I think similarly to not that they're bound, but, what are some things that have come to the fore? And I think for Sasha, similarly, there's the reality of picking objects that can stand up to this type of tactile handling, but it's also about what kinds of objects maybe you have found that this particular audience responds best to. So Michelle, I'm dying to know what themes actually, there's such a wealth of different things to choose from in the artworks that are at Melchers. So I'm just curious there. And if Sasha, you can follow up by, what sculptures really resonate for this program.
So currently I have 4 lesson plans, Picturing New Connection lesson plans. And the 4 themes that I have right now, one that I have not taught in person yet, but I've taught virtually, is the holidays. And I think that resonates with everyone. And if you see, let's see if I move the right way. So behind me is Gari Melchers painting the Nativity. And so that's a cornerstone of that particular theme. The other theme is chores, which is a lot of fun because we all do chores, whether it's taking out the trash or mowing the yard or, having your home garden, something like that. And a lot of people remember how their parents used to, have to use, those irons that you put in the oven and warm up. I mean, it was just crazy. Or they remember doing it themselves as kids. Another theme is titled Going to the Fair. So there's a painting of the Fredericksburg Fair, and it was a horse race that took place at the fair. And I think, again, a lot of us have grown up going to county fairs and, enjoying the sights and smells of the fair, whether it's, popcorn, cotton candy, all the animals and action. And what's interesting is Gari Melchers actually, he would attend the fair and then he would photograph the fair. So I was able to share, some of his artistic process when I shared his photographs with them. And then let's see, the fourth one is, I think it has to do with the three senses. And that one features the gentleman getting a shave at the barber shop, the sermon with the children in the choir, and also Cigar Store Indian that Gari Melchers' father sculpted. So I think as long as you don't pick something that's too esoteric, and
Are there any topics to like the kinds of things you mentioned? There's sort of like common activities of life. Does that work better with this Alzheimer's group versus like what about parents and children? Or I mean, are there types of subjects that are more fruitful for this kind of reacting and responding?
Well, I guess I tend towards those topics because that's the type of thing that Gari Melchers liked to paint. So that's what I draw from. I could definitely see, mothers and children or parenting, something like that. And hopefully I can develop something along those lines because he did paint a lot of mothers and children, mothers and babies and things like that.
So Sasha, what do people, what do you find for that particular audience really resonates in terms of being able to touch on what you consider when selecting beyond what are, the things you must consider relative to the safety of the object itself and whether it's appropriate?
It's interesting because for us, the object choice and the theme is absolutely interlocked. And so in terms of objects, I don't think we've ever had any objects that were not well received. What's really interesting is the reactions to larger sculptures. Small sculptures, especially since Chaim's are quite often, his works are quite often figurative. People can just take it, hold it in their hand, and within a minute or two, they know exactly what it is, and they have a quick understanding of it. And this is, from our low vision or blind group. But with a larger sculpture, you can't take it in as quickly. Very often, if you're standing in front of it, you're eye to eye. So maybe you have to run your hands down. You might have to crouch, get lower to feel the bottom. So even if maybe it's like, for example, a figure on a unicycle. So they'll feel the top, they understand it's a figure, and then they get to the bottom and maybe they're sort of flummoxed, like, oh, I feel like a big lump here. It feels like a big circle. Like, what is it? And then we get to tell them it's a unicycle. And there's like this moment of understanding, and it's really exciting. But I was very excited to hear Michelle's themes because I think quite often, Chaim's works, for example, they're acrobats, they're not that relatable, but then you have like a mother and child, and that's very, very relatable for anyone in the audience, anyone in the group. And we do rotate our themes constantly. I actually sometimes tell my educators, you don't have to mix it up every time, but that's part of their joy and creativity in doing the work. So we actually frequently touch completely different sets of materials from session to session. And so that is a conversation every time. So that's, once again, that investment of time. You're analyzing each individual work for its, its safety, its merit within the program. And we organize the themes based on current events. For example, if it's Women's History Month, we may focus on women artists in the collection. We also utilize our second floor temporary exhibition space, whatever exhibition is there at the time, to direct our themes. So when we had it all fantasy drawings, so very surreal sketches by Chaim, we had a lot of our sessions focused on those drawings. And then now we have a show called Artists and Immigrants, and that is a selection of works from the collection, including over 50 artists and 100 works. So there's a lot of options there. And once again, the creativity of the educators becomes really, really clear. And that's always a dialogue that we as a staff are having with them.
So do you have to then kind of conserve the pieces that get touched in this program? Is that part of, how do you, or they just, because it sounds like you really use a lot of the collection just depending on in this, and that's in keeping with Chaim Gross's vision for her, how his sculptures will be interacted with. But have you found that conservation then needs to be a piece of that, if people are touching?
We usually try to have those conversations ahead of time. So if anything needs treatment, for example, with sculpture, waxing is a big concern. So wax, microcrystalline wax is essentially like a protective layer. That's usually one of the ways that we would sort of pre-treat the object. But obviously, if anything shows any signs of change, then that's when we would stop using it as an object for these sessions.
And I think what's interesting, Michelle, is even though Melchers is really understood as a painter, and that's sort of your departing point for these programs, tangible objects play a role in the way in which you engage your audience too, and through touch. And so want you to talk a little bit about what for some of us is a known thing. Certainly in my experiences at Alana, we had collections that were not accessioned collections, which of course could not be touched. And so can you talk a little bit more about what it means to have this sort of teaching collection, and what it means to audience, and how you select and find things, but also I happen to know that not necessarily created directly for this program, but one of your images showed a 3D printed object of what is probably an object no one could touch. So how that technology, it's interesting the sort of juxtaposition between a 3D printed plaster head and like a piece of farm equipment that is probably, incredibly aged, and sort of what you find the layering in of that teaching collection means to this program, and talk a little bit more about the concept of that type of collection and how you're using 3D technology as well. That's a lot, but all to go back to really a program centered in someone who is a painter.
So we were lucky enough to partner with UVA, because I was experimenting with 3D printed pieces, but I couldn't find a source to do a full scale 3D printed piece. And that was really my goal. And so this was, a while ago. It's probably a little more prevalent now, but in there, I think it was their engineering department, but they did it for companies. You just pay a fee and they would, pop out a 3D whatever you needed. But I was lucky enough that someone from UVA could come to our site and scan some of our objects, and then have them printed on campus for for a couple $100. It wasn't too expensive. And so we chose 2 busts that Gari Melchers' father made, and then also a bas relief sort of side view of Gary Melchers that Paul Manship made for him. They sort of exchanged art. And so Gary painted a picture of, Paul Manship, and Paul Manship did this bas relief of Gary. And I would love to do more, but it's become more complicated just because we have to have art handlers now. It used to be we would just kind of pack it up very carefully and drive it to UVA, but it's a lot more expensive to do now. But those items have been valuable throughout my programming. We also host a beeping egg hunt for children that are visually impaired or blind and their families. And so we're able to use those in the studio. And then the rest of the education collection, it's just been fun to build over the years. And, there isn't a whole lot you can touch in the studio. I mean, we do have a touch tour, but it doesn't always relate to, whatever I'm teaching about. So I'm able to really carefully curate the collection to reflect the themes in Gary Melchers' art.
Thank you.
So Michelle, you alluded to the beeping egg and the touch tour. Are there programs other programs you are doing for accessibility, or that both of you dream of doing? I mean, it does sound like these are really, there's a lot of emphasis on these, but what else are you doing, or do you want to do that we could learn from and seek to our own sites?
So the core sort of accessible programs that I teach include Picturing New Connections. And then I also teach Preschool Palette, which is for children ages 2 to 5, because I saw a gap in the, arts learning community for the really young children. Mostly, no one really taught the little ones, they just taught the school age children. So I focused on that. And then we do the beeping egg hunt once a year. And Sasha, I would love to ask you a question if you've had any experience. We have verbal descriptions of, some of our larger paintings, but with children, it doesn't seem to hold their attention as much as I would like. Do you have any experience with children in your programs?
No, we don't. Unfortunately, I can't speak to that. But we were given a very generous grant from the HAHS program and the National Trust. So we are working now to develop some programs for children that will be available next year, although that is not specifically accessibility minded.
Mm-hmm.
Although that will be an element, it's not the core focus. I will say that we started Tactile Transmissions as kind of our first foray into accessibility, except for, like I mentioned, sort of a few attempts here and there previously where we had really wonderful experiences, but they weren't repeatable. So the idea with Tactile Transmissions was coming up with something that had longevity and could, reach more people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do people return to these programs, or do you see a new audience at each one?
For us, there's a lot of people who come month after month, but we're always happy to have new faces. That makes it more fun for us to, see our old friends, but then also welcome the new.
Yeah, I see a lot of repeat visitors. Most of them are coming from support groups that are hosted by the Alzheimer's Association. So that's a really good connection for us. Unfortunately, with dementia, it's a progressive disease. So there's always going to be turnover, because at a certain point, this type of program isn't going to work for them anymore. Sometimes it's just hard leaving the house with all the uncertainty and getting in the car and being in a new place. So yeah, it's sad, but I guess, something you have to acknowledge. Like, so the people that came in 2019 no longer come to the program.
And I think what I find interesting about both these programs is there is this sort of component of reacting to the art of someone else's making, but very, very much a part of this program is attendee as maker. And I just sort of, which I think is even more powerful being done in a place of a maker. I mean, so many different types of arts and cultural organizations offer art making, but I think, we would argue in HAHS, as all of you probably would argue, there's something different about creating in the place of a maker, surrounded by making materials and the frenetic energy that I still think resides there. And I just am curious, clearly that was a decision, right? As you both developed this program, these respective programs, and clearly there has been a response, right? So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that aspect of making and why you included it and what your observations are and what it has meant to the people who honestly show up for these programs. And Sasha, you could start if you want to kick it off.
Perfect. For us, that, including making works, drawings, sculpture, that was very early on in our discussions. We found that was going to be an integral part because you're in the studio space. And we don't have a dedicated separate educational location where we can look at works and then move to somewhere else. So we actually have our participants making the work while they're in the studio and while they're in the exhibition space. So I think that's very significant. They're quite literally surrounded by Chaim Gross's work and the work of other artists as they're doing these activities. And what was really helpful for me in sort of these initial conversations around why drawing and making is so significant was talking to our consultant, Pamela Lawton. And she talked about how the physical process of making something, and specifically drawing, but this extends to other methods too, is very informative. It teaches you something that you don't necessarily understand just by listening. And it's true. Sometimes if there's a smaller group and I want to participate, I will participate in the activities as well. And I always come away understanding the works a little bit differently. So I think there's a lot of intelligence to that. And also the connection to the workspace where an artist worked for 28 years. There's no way to understate how powerful that is, or overstate how powerful that is.
Sasha, that gives me an idea. I would love to do something in our studio space, maybe something, kind of akin to what you're doing. I think that would be really well received. I wasn't sure how people were going to think. I was worried that participants would feel like, oh, I'm not an artist. Why, I don't want to do this. But I made it approachable enough that anyone could do it. And but if there, and I'm thinking of two couples in particular, the person suffering from dementia was a very talented artist. And unfortunately, that was one of the first things that Alzheimer's took away from them. And the spouses, would just get teary-eyed watching, their loved one making art again, just in a different way. They would often bring their sketchbooks with them, or collections of what they used to do. Yeah, I'm getting teary-eyed too, but it's just a really special time especially for couples, to bond again in a very, just a very normal setting. And they're being, no one's talking down to them. They're feeling, really good about what they're doing. And it's great. And it's relaxing. It's so relaxing. I mean, especially for the caregivers, there's so much stress in their life and so much uncertainty, but just to relax among people who know what you're going through, and to do something, beautiful, but not too hard, but related to what you were talking about. It's just, Yeah, I think it means a lot to them, and it nurtures their relationship, because so much of the relationship, things are taken away, and this is something that they can, be in the present for and enjoy together, and yeah, it's fun, and it's different every time. It's different, with new people. It's different with projects. It's a lot of fun too. There's a lot of playful aspects to it. And I tell you what, they surprise the heck out of me with what they're creating. They really do. You look around and you're like, they've flipped the whole project on its head and they're taking it in a new direction. So it hits a part of their brain that isn't affected by the memory loss, and they're able, they don't have to talk. They can just do it and enjoy it and really get something out of it.
Michelle, I'm so curious whether this is something that you've thought about bringing out into memory care units or training other people to do. It sounds like this when you're talking about the just the impact that it has. I mean, I know you can't bring Melchers' actual works there, but reproductions of them maybe.
If I would love to bring. I haven't really started that conversation yet. I've toured a lot of memory care facilities in preparation for, in development of this program, because I thought it was important to see what they were doing. I think just because I'm sort of a one-person show and wear a lot of different hats, if I had, maybe more staff or maybe just a little bit more time, I could take it into the memory care facilities, but they honestly do a pretty darn good job on their own. They do all the same things, the smell, there's a lot of music, there's a lot of live music, they do dancing. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. They have a lot of resources. I mean, of course, if anyone asked me, I would certainly, help. Unfortunately, a program like this needs a champion. And if that champion retires, changes jobs, moves, oftentimes that program goes away because not everyone is comfortable with it for whatever reason. Maybe there's, I can't really say why, but so, I mean, I'd be happy, you don't even really need me to come in and teach you, because Meet Me at MoMA did such an amazing job laying everything out for us. You just have to figure out how you want to tweak it to meet your needs. And in my blog post, I have a list of resources that would get anyone started in a memory loss program, because you can just take take what works for your site and what you're able to do. And I think anyone could do it.
Michelle, that's so inspiring, because many of our visitors, including many people who are here because of access programming, but through our tactile transmissions program, have mentioned the fact that our space reminds them of their parents' house or their grandparents' house. It has the same kind of nostalgic effect. So I'm so happy to hear you talk about how you developed your program, because I think that perhaps that's something that we can think about as well.
I think it would work really well.
I think I'm just struck by what are clearly also your very personal connections that you feel to the people who attend these programs. And, I think, you've alluded to it, Michelle, sort of, you get sort of, you're surprised at what you see come out in the art making. I think I'm curious to know a little bit beyond the art making, are there, what have been some more meaningful, let's say, observations or connections that people have made to these themes that you're bringing forward, and with Sasha, unexpected outcomes almost is what I'm looking for. What is something that may have surprised you as you were engaged in this? What is clearly a very intimate exchange that occurs between you and those who are there and who are participating, and, you know, what has been inspiring to you that's come out of this program?
Wow, that's a good question. I'm constantly surprised. I'm constantly surprised at the insight people have. I mean, just out of the blue, they'll realize something or notice something, you know, and I've worked at Gari Melchers' home studio for over 15 years. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I've never noticed that in that painting. I've never thought about it. And it's just such a fresh look. Once we were doing, I think this was last year, we were working on a project, and this was for the, you know, going to the fair, and they were making a quilt, and we were eating popcorn because that's what you do when you talk about the fair. And one of the participants included her popcorn into the quilt project. And she's like, look, that's pretty awesome. You know, it's very similar working with children. I mean, they can just surprise you in so many just lovely ways, and take it in different directions. And you do learn about their lives. I mean, it's just like a extremely personal connection that they'll have to something. And they're like, I remember when I was growing up, you know, we lived you know, I had a picture that had snow in it, and he was feeding the sheep, and I remember snow. And, you know, for someone with memory loss, that's a big deal. And you try and tap into those early memories, and with, you know, whatever art you're showing. And you can see the caregiver, the husband or the wife, just turn to them, and just, you can see the love flowing between them. And they're just so proud of their spouse, you know, that they get to, you know, take part in this very, I don't know, elegant program, and feel very grown up and real and seen and heard, and not have to worry about the chaos, you know, going out in the outside world. And it's just a little slice of quiet in the crazy noise that is their life, ever changing. So yeah, I mean, it's hugs all around when we finish every single program. It's just so sweet.
And Sasha, what have you learned? I mean, there's so many ways in which this is sort of a unique program, touching sculpture, which is so often taboo in this field, and sort of using interesting materials and sort of drawing in 3D and all of these things coming together in a moment with people who are perhaps using, you know, enhanced sensory aspects beyond, you know, that counterbalance sometimes, you know, having challenges with sight. You know, what have you learned from that? Beyond when you partake personally in an exercise, which of course we all should do, frankly, to keep ourselves like fresh and understanding who we're doing this work for. But I'm interested, you know, because there are so many unique things that you brought to this program in terms of approach and materials. You know, what did you learn through these people who were participating in that?
Oh my gosh, so much. I mean, I think I'm lucky because I get to engage with so many different people through the foundation. Not only Tactile Transmissions, but tours as well. And I get to learn about them. And, you know, the population that we're working with is very different. You know, they don't have memory loss, there's no cognitive issues. So for the most part, we're dealing with people who are, you know, people no different than we are. And, you know, they may have vision loss, but otherwise they have wonderful backstories and personalities. And I think Michelle alluded earlier to how a lot of times the programs are funny. And I feel like with our groups, a lot of times we spend a lot of time just laughing. Either we're touching a sculpture that has humor to it, or someone has a funny story to share. But what I've learned is that, you know, you mentioned sort of that sort of enhanced maybe other senses. And I do notice that when people use their haptic sense, if they're tactily touching something, and that's a very important sense for them, is a lot of times they're a lot faster, I think, in figuring out what something is. Very quickly they know, like, for example, if we have like a mask or a face, sculpture, like a bust of someone, they're able to kind of discern that very, very quickly. And to be honest, I don't know if a sighted person would be able to do that. But I would say that I learn by meeting new people and having these experiences, and it's very rewarding.
Amy, you're muted.
I was just going to say, I think this has been very inspiring to all of us at SAIS to think about how we can incorporate some of these things. You're in a way, you're talking about very simple things that we do all the time, like engage people with the art, and yet it's just a question of engaging them through these different sensory means. So I think how it sounds emotionally weighty, some of it, but it sounds practically within the grasp. So I find that's like a really encouraging thing. I feel very inspired by what you all have shared with us today. Valerie, do you want to do some help wrap up things?
Well, I think that what has been really interesting here again is just, for me, an affirmation of what at the core of these HAHS sites is where incredible creativity happened, right? And so it shouldn't be surprising that the ways in which that can be spun out to really connect with really anybody that we'd like to engage with. And I think what we've sort of found out through, it can be very daunting when you consider it, especially as a small staff or even a large staff, right? It doesn't matter, especially if a new project is happening. About that, I think as Michelle so aptly put right from the beginning, we just decided to sort of go and, with the underpinnings of good partners and people that you have talked to and resources that you've engaged with, to make sure that you're hearing from those who are knowledgeable about who you're trying to reach. But it doesn't need to be fancy, and the outcomes don't need to be. I love that you both said that it's about laughing and about, really just experiential is what we are really giving through these HAHS sites. And I think from those of us who might be joining today who are not insiders into sort of the exploration of how do you do a program and why you do a program, sort of this sort of consistent desire on the part of those of us who are trying to make these experiences meaningful for those who come to our sites, how we think about those things and the multiple ways in which we can make that occur. And that these particular sites, whether you are engaged in a very specific program or honestly, whether many attending might want to just come and go on a regular, everyday tour, there's such a wealth of sensory things that happen in these spaces that you are able to connect with. And that connection doesn't necessarily need to be at a highest esoteric level per se. It can be on something very, very experience specific, and that's okay too. And I love that this, that this can be a window into what is really possible for any visitor in terms of engaging with art and what you want to get out of that experience and what is possible. And I just want to add that for those who do not, this is the first moment in which they have heard of the Chaim and Renee and Chaim Gross site. Many are familiar with the HAHS virtual road trip, and you can come and hear more about the Gross site as they will be featured in the August road trip, where you will get to see more of these rooms and more of these sculptures, at least through virtual experience. And I think both of these programs ultimately prove that there is something really magical and non-replicable about experiencing art in person, no matter who you are and what you bring to that experience beyond just what we as interpreters and curators may seek to impart on all of you as visitors, that there is always room for what Sasha and Michelle have so beautifully illustrated, that in the end it is about the visitor experience. So I thank them for recentering us in that in some pretty powerful, I think, ways. And with that, Amy, any last words of thank you, and I hope you'll see us next week, basically.
Yeah, definitely see us next week for the session that is about spreading the word about collaborative projects that help extend knowledge of your site beyond the corners of your property. And then Valerie mentioned the road trip that will feature the Grow site, but also the one that is coming up next features the Coos Sharp Historic Site in Taos, New Mexico, where you can learn about E.I. Kaus and Henry Sharp, who are founding members of the Taos Art Colony. And that is going to be on May 25th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. So I will drop a link in the chat about that. And just want to thank both of you for this wonderful and really inspiring conversation. And if you want to support more of what HAHS does, please consider visiting this link in the chat to donate to HAHS. So we will see you all next week. And thank you so much, Sasha and Michelle and Valerie, all of you. This is really, really great.
Thank you.
Bye.